right, welcome into Carps Corner, and my goodness, world burning in college football right now. It's absolutely crazy. So, I want to get one in here before the 4th of July. Make sure everybody got to hear some thoughts of everything that's going on with the Big Ten movement. UCLA, USC joining the Big Ten. A lot of tentacles off this. George Kliavkoff, the commissioner, I thought was doing a good job of the Pac-12. They've had a mess out there he was trying to take care of. Larry Scott ran that conference into the ground. And with that, they had a litany of issues. George Kliavkoff was trying to solve their revenue problem, solve their exposure problem, solve the fan apathy problem. And I think what it came down to is basically UCLA and USC looked at this and said, best case scenario, we're probably getting $40-45 million tops. Big Ten, Illinois, Rutgers, they're going to be getting $100 million. Schools like that. And so we'd rather be over there with these guys. UCLA is running a huge budget deficit. They need to get some help. Or UCLA is running a huge budget deficit. They need some help. USC, this gives them a chance to be more competitive, get back to the main stage, back to prime time, like they've been for so many years. But the USC is the premier brand west of the Rockies. They've got a litany of Heisman winners. They've got a ton of national championships. And I think they're looking to get back to that. Obviously, Lincoln Riley, coming there will help. But the Big Ten now has the 3 biggest markets in all of the United States. They've got Chicago, they've got LA, and they have the Northeast and New York, New Jersey. Do people care about Rutgers in New York? Do they care about Northwestern in Chicago? Do they care about USC, UCLA, and LA? I think to the last extent that, USC people do care. They don't really show up to the games, but I'll tell you this, people in those markets, they care about Ohio State. They'll care about Michigan. Like they care about big traditional brands. And so they'll watch them maybe more than they will their own schools that are indigenous to their region. And so there's a lot that goes into that. But now Big Ten covering literally sea to shining sea, from Piscataway all the way to LA, the city of angels. And so how did this probably get started? Martin Jarman is the athletic director at UCLA. He took over a mess there. He was at Boston College before. Prior to that, he was an associate at Ohio State for a number of years, worked closely with Gene Smith. You look at USC's AD coming from Cincinnati, also Ohio ties, also knowing Gene Smith. I think Gene Smith was the critical piece to help get this done. And now make no mistake about it. Martin Jarman connection, obviously the connection with USC and their AD being at Cincinnati. And the fact that Gene Smith and President Christina Johnson, they were the first to address this publicly, not the Big Ten commissioner. Kevin Warren's in London. They were the ones out there. And also keep an eye on this. Christina Johnson, where'd she go to school? Where's she from? Stanford. Played sports out there. Another great institution, very aligned with the Big Ten and what they do. I'd give you the Bay Area market to a certain extent. And so I think that's good. I think this is ultimately great for the Big Ten. It's a sad day for me in college football because I'm a traditionalist. I like to have gone back to the BCS conferences. I liked it when there were 6. You pulled it into the Power 5. Okay, that's all right. But I like the regionality of the sport. But as soon as you saw Texas and OU leave last year and the dollars that were getting thrown at them and the facilitation of ESPN, you knew the Big Ten ultimately couldn't stand still, that Fox ultimately wouldn't stand still. And I think Fox was a player in this, helping to facilitate as well. Fox is located in LA. There's a lot of people that are grads from there. They have ties to both of those schools and saying, hey, you know what? This is a great opportunity to help enhance your revenue. It'll give us a better product to sell. It answers a lot of questions. So while expansion, I think in college football, I'm not huge for all of the conference moving and the dilution of some conferences, because let's be real. I mean, probably the next best play is going to end up being the Pac-12 and Big 12, like pseudo merger, and who eats whom in that. I'm not really sure, and how that looks, who has more of the power. Arizona schools, Cal, maybe, I don't know if Stanford comes, Colorado sliding back in. Washington State and Oregon State are kind of on an island, because here's the other piece. I've talked to some people on the West Coast. next week, I've been told that there will be an announcement for Washington and Oregon also joining the Big Ten. Get the Seattle market with Washington. They've got a good athletic program, good football. Oregon, not the biggest market in the world, but it's a national brand. It's Phil Knight. It's the Nike Association. They have beautiful facilities, great track and field. Basketball has been good. A lot of great other sports as well. And they've got tons of cash. And they're a national brand. So you're going to pull those two in. And so with that, that's going to bring the Big Ten on my account to 18 schools with the addition of the 4 Pac-12. I think what that does by adding those 4 Pac-12 schools in Washington, Oregon, USC, and UCLA, Notre Dame sees the shifting landscape. They understand that there's probably going to be 2 mega conferences. They're not going to be able to be an island. They know it now. I've heard people talk. Brady Quinn, it's a friend of mine, Columbus native, Notre Dame alum. He's always been negative on the Big Ten ever being in the equation with Notre Dame. But I've heard him speak yesterday on this and understanding, well, one of your big West Coast rivals, USC's in, maybe you pull Stanford in with Notre Dame, but regardless of the fact that that's set there, you're going to have to get a seat because the Big Ten and SEC are basically going to be deciding the future of college football over the next decade. Next 3 to 4 years, they're going to shape what's going to happen over the next 10 to 13. And that's a reality. So Notre Dame, they want to get a seat at the table. And I believe that the USC addition, maybe a Stanford to pull Notre Dame in. Maybe they don't need them. Maybe the Big Ten poaches North Carolina and they go to the ACC and try to pull someone in there. But this is not done. And next week, I'm sure we'll be talking about Oregon and Washington and that being done. And then the potential of who else they're adding. And the main ingredient of this is they're negotiating the media rights deal right now, currently. So they're going to have an idea of who's coming. They're going to want to get this thing done by season, mid-season, whatever it's going to wrap up. And those dollars are going to be big. They're going to be over $100 million now. They said Apple just got back in the mix after they heard of USC, UCLA. They know it. They're not dumb. You have the whole country now and some good programs to boot. What I don't think the Big Ten wants to do is just add for proximity without program strength, because that's what happened with Maryland and Rutgers. They haven't had the program strength, and because of that, it's been a little rough and some heavy sledding for them to be able to move forward and have success. So I don't think they want to do that. But if you look at this, the TV implications. Last year, you saw Texas and OU jettison to the SEC. And behind the scenes, the SEC had negotiated with ESPN where they basically had a bucket of teams. It's like the equivalent to a baseball trade, players to be named later. You get so many players you put that you're willing to part with, and you pick a couple from those. But they put together a couple of teams where whatever the contract was, and when you added schools, you weren't going to divide the pie more. You were going to add 2 more whole slices of teams. So they didn't have to split up the current revenue. ESPN was going to give them whole nother shares to be able to facilitate Oklahoma and Texas coming in. And that was with steep buyouts. That is why they haven't left yet and probably won't leave for at least another year, maybe 2. Fox saw that and don't think while they were negotiating this thing right now saw, hey, this is a chance for us to take back some of that land, those markets, that value that the ESPN and the SEC tried to take away. Because that's kind of where we are now. We're living in a world where the TV dollars and the television and media partners, they're driving the bus. People might not like it, but that's the reality of what's happening. Like, they're driving the bus, and you can be upset about it. You can argue about it. Do I like USC and UCLA being in the Big Ten? For football and historically, no. But where we're at right now, I think it's the only logical solution to be able to have success and sustainability. So I'm grateful that my conference, the Big Ten, has been held in check. The fact that Ohio State still holds the premier seat there, they didn't have to balance conferences. Gene Smith alluded today that during COVID, he was highly frustrated with the direction of the conference and not playing, and thought about going independent and signing up their own TV rights deal and everything else, because he knows that's the type of power they have. And so that's why with this, I think Gene was the one out in front driving the bus. And it's to Ohio State's benefit. They're going to get more money. everybody in the conference is ultimately going to get more money. That's going to help them grow facilities, pay coaches. It's going to help non-revenue sports, but it's also going to help fill the gap of funding that was lost by donations and sponsorships due to NIL, because that money now is going directly to the players. So that's one of the elements of it. What's going to be left of the Pac-12? Well, like I said, you have the Arizona schools out there, a couple, Colorado, Utah. I mean, do they slide in and join the Big 12? I think that'd be logical. Utah could go in with BYU. They're coming in. Colorado was already in the Big 12. The Arizona schools aren't that far away from some of the Western reach. So that makes a little bit of sense. And I think that'll kind of be your Western Conference. And some of the Washington states and the Oregon states, they'll probably slide into the WAC. What happens to Stanford and Cal? I don't know. I don't think the Big Ten truly wants them, because I don't think they add a ton of pop for football. And I don't think they add a ton of pop for market. And so when you look at those two things, you got to provide one of them. Yeah, the Bay Area is there, but I don't think people truly care about college football that much in the Bay Area. So what happens to Stanford and Cal? I don't know. I do know this. I guarantee you that the ACC last night was on the horn. Commissioner Phillips, who was a Northwestern's AD before taking this job a couple of years ago, probably trying to solidify everything that's going on. Does the SEC go after Clemson? Do they go after a Florida State to have all the Florida schools? Does Ohio State go after a North Carolina and pair them with Notre Dame and say, hey, we're bringing in a school that's very like-minded to us, great academics, great public institution, good football, good basketball, gives you most of the Charlotte market. Carolina's the premier brand in North Carolina, and it's a national brand. And so all that goes on the horizon, shaping up right there. It all makes sense. And then as you look at the rights situation, why did this happen now? Why did this happen now? Well, after talking with Jeff Schwartz yesterday on SiriusXM, he'd said, I think July 1st was the deadline for the Pac-12 schools to be able to opt out in 2024, and doing so without penalty. So Larry Scott, the former AD, set it up to where schools, if you just announce by this date, you're allowed to leave, you don't have to worry about it. And you send your notice in. I think ultimately, like I said, Washington will move out. Oregon will. They'll probably try to get their notice in, obviously, before the day is done. But July 1st was that date. And it's the difference now from these schools going from potentially, like I said, 35, 25, 40 high end in revenue from their media rights deal every year to now going over to 100. And so as you look at the landscape, ACC 35 to 40 million, SEC's 100 million with the Big Ten, they're over that. Big 12 wasn't great, bringing in somewhere around, probably outside of Texas and OU, because they got larger splits. I mean, people were getting 25, 30 million. Pac-12 was getting like 20. Like, there's just not anything else out there to compete. And folks, those are deficits you run every year. That's not a one-off. That's not an expenditure. That's like someone is making $25,000 more than you a year. It's not, can I spend $25,000 more one-off? It's every year they're gaining more and more ground. And you have to be able to fundraise that to make up the difference, or just have lesser facilities and lesser coaches. And with that, that's going to provide another litany of problems. That's going to provide another ton of issues. And so how are you going to solve those problems? What's the solution? Heck, I don't know. There's a lot there to it. It's an interesting time. But I know this, the Big Ten is stronger today. College football, I think, is weaker today. We're losing a lot of the pageantry, the tradition, the geography that made it so great. I hope the fan passion doesn't disappear because of it, but it's nothing like people recognize from 25 years ago. And that saddens me. I'm glad where my institution and my conference is at, and they're going to have a seat at the table, one at the big boy table. But I used to love watching Cal Stanford. I loved it when it was the Big East and Miami was playing West Virginia and Virginia Tech and Pitt. Like, I like those things. And now all of a sudden it's all gotten muddled up, and I get it. It's TV dollars and it makes sense, but it doesn't mean that I have to like it. That can be the case, but it doesn't mean that I have to like it. And so while I'm glad it happened for my conference, it saddens me a little bit to see something that I care about so much disappear. And the fact that if you're the Pac-12 commissioner and George Kliavkoff, you were doing everything you could, you were putting yourself in the best situation to succeed. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, it didn't matter. And so that's what we've got to deal with right now. That's what he is facing. And they're in full on scramble mode in the Pac-12, probably the Big 12 a little bit too, because everybody's picking up the phones. How are you going to be able to trust other schools in your conference? How are you going to be able to trust, long-standing rivals? You're not going to be able to do that because everybody now is looking at this. This is what Jim Phillips, the commissioner of the ACC, is going to have to deal with. Man, it's every man for himself, every school for themselves. And so you've got to try to way to form and coalesce together to have success. Because remember, we had the alliance and the Big Ten, E2 Brute, poached them and took care of that. So that's all for this edition of Carps Corner. Subscribe, like, share, throw up your questions. We'll be doing more of this next week. Have a happy 4th of July.